This movie is the second movie about collisions in Unity. Just to review a couple concepts we learned in the last movie, every 3D game object comes with a collider component. You can see it here for the sphere. It's called the sphere collider. You can see it here for the plane. It's called the mesh collider. The other thing to note about that is you can put a material on a collider. I made a physics material called bouncy stuff, and I made it bouncy so that both the sphere and the plane will bounce. I put that material on the mesh collider for the plane. I put it on the sphere collider for the sphere. Another thing to note is that the sphere, in the sphere, I added a rigid body component. The rigid body component allows the 3D game object to interact with Unity's physics engine. That's the built-in physics in Unity, so that when the object collides with other objects, it acts like a real-life object. For the plane, I did not add a rigid body. That makes the plane a static collider. What that means is that things can collide with it, but it really won't respond. It'll act like the physics engine doesn't really apply to it. So if you don't add a rigid body to something, it's called a static collider. Let's look at some more aspects of this. I have my plane selected. I'm going to go over to its mesh collider and hit convex. When I do, I have something available called isTrigger. Basically, when an object is a trigger object, it really won't do anything about collisions, but it will detect them. So the plane now will detect a collision and call a method that we'll see in a moment in a script, but it won't respond to the collision. And you can see it right here. The ball hits the plane and falls through. So really the plane doesn't act like a real object anymore. It just acts as a trigger. A lot of times we use invisible game objects as a trigger to see if another object has entered a certain area or interacted with another game object. What would you do about a trigger object? How would you use the message that's sent when another object triggers it? You would use a method called onTriggerEnter. There's actually two more. There's an onTriggerStay and an onTriggerExit. Whatever code you want to have happen when a game object hits another game object, you put on the onTriggerEnter method. Now I had to attach that method to the plane, and you can see it right here. It says collision script. So that when that collision happens, I print out a little message. There it is. So not a big deal. Just a way to detect collisions. And just to note, even if an object isn't a trigger, we can detect the collision in code. And there is a method to do that, and I believe it's called onCollision. So it's not onTrigger, it's onCollision. More on that later, but just to note, whether an object is a trigger or not, you can always detect collision in code. One more thing I wanted to tell you about is something down here in the rigid body component. It's called isKinematic. Whenever an object is kinematic, what it means is the only way you can move that object is through your script, and it will not respond to the physics engine contained in Unity. So, for example, let me go back to my plane again. I'm going to unclick isTrigger because I want it to act like a normal object. And I'm going to just replay my scene again just to remind us what it does. The ball bounces. Now, if I go over and click isKinematic for the sphere, the ball, basically what's going to happen is this. Nothing, the ball will not move unless I move it in code. So isKinematic means the only way I can move it is through code. One more thing to tell you about rigid bodies, just as a reminder, I don't know if I told you this, is the constraints on movement. You can constrain an axis with regard to position or rotation when you use a rigid body. The last thing I want to mention, that really I'm not going to demonstrate here, is raycasting. Ray casting is something where an object can send out a ray, an imaginary ray, or an invisible ray, if you will, and anything that's in that ray's line of sight will be detected. That's how you detect things that are way off, away from the object. In other words, we use a lot of things to detect when things collide next to each other, but we can also use ray casting to figure out when an object is in our path, or maybe when an object is coming toward us. Your book does a decent job of explaining ray casting on page 169. And just as a little side note, on page 169 at the top, it lists a matrix of all the different types of colliders and how they interact with each other. So check that out and you'll learn more about collisions.